What's good, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Over Quota. Please subscribe, rate, and review if you haven't already. And like always, the J. David Group, which is my company, is sponsoring this podcast. We help recruit today's go-to-market teams that will lead the next generation of unicorns. This podcast is also being sponsored by Allego, which allows you to record your best content for practice, collaboration, and feedback, and gives sales orgs a way to organize all of the best content in one place so it's easily accessible to every everybody. Email me web@thejdavidgroup.com so I can personally introduce you to someone who will take great care of you. Now, my guest today is Douglas Cole, an enterprise sales leader at LinkedIn, an advisor with startup accelerators in Canada and the United States, a part-time university lecturer at the Rotman School of Management and the Schulich Executive Education Center in Toronto, and most recently, a published author. His book, Sales MBA, How to Influence Corporate Buyers, is why I invited him on so we can all become smarter and more mentally ready to navigate the complexities of enterprise sales. Douglas, welcome to Over Quota.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So let me start with a question that you might be familiar with in a way, which is, who is your audience? And why should this book matter to them?
I would say my primary audience would be enterprise sales professionals. In other words, people who are trying to sell to corporate buyers within relatively large organizations, 1,000 employees plus, let's say. Mm-hmm. So that's my primary audience. However, I think that it's natural for me to think as well about a secondary audience, because one of the things I believe is that selling skills are, on the one hand, something that obviously the sales professional has to perfect and craft, but I think any knowledge worker, especially nowadays, needs to get better and better at influencing, not just selling per se, but influencing. And I think that knowledge workers who need to influence have a lot to learn from salespeople who specialize in the craft of influence. So primary audience, enterprise sellers; secondary audience, knowledge workers who are autodidacts looking to get better as influencers.
And as they put the book down, after having read all, I think, roughly 192 pages, what would you like them to take away from it? What specifics should they have in their arsenal, would you say?
Well, I have chosen to emphasize three domains that I think are really essential to the mindset of anyone who's trying to influence. I've talked about understanding external dynamics and organizational dynamics and interpersonal dynamics. And so I think the mindset shift that I'm recommending is one that tries to go deeper in terms of one's understanding of each of those realms in order to be much more effective as an influencer. And so the book is all about changing your mindset with reference to those three themes in particular.
Got it. And I want to get into those in a moment and spend a lot of time on the decision architect. I find that, the change agent. I spent a lot of time just wrapped in that aspect of it, which we'll dive in a minute. But let's just zoom out for a moment. And tell me how we got here. Tell me a little bit about your background and what led you to say, you know what, this is a book that I want to write, and now is the time for me to write it.
Yeah, well, I got into sales, I would say, as many people do, somewhat serendipitously. It wasn't anything that was formally planned as a career. I was actually working for most of my career in consulting. And for a raft of reasons, I got out of that and I went into tech and entrepreneurship. And then I eventually got into sales. And when I got into sales, I was not sure whether I would like it. And in fact, in the first few months, I was sort of questioning my decision. But as I got into sales, I started to discover that it was intrinsically fascinating, much more fascinating than I anticipated, because it involved psychology, it involved strategy, it involved a very practical project management. I mean, those just really stood out as being the core components of people who did this stuff well. And because I'm a natural learner and I want to understand the essence of things, as I tried to push myself to learn this unfamiliar realm as best I could, the more I learned, the more I realized there was more to learn. And the more I became motivated to try to codify my knowledge for the benefit of other people, because I had a sense that because I was approaching this issue as an outsider, in a sense, not as a career salesperson, but someone who had a consulting background, an academic background, I just felt I was bringing a slightly different way of understanding the sales challenge that was based really on first principles. And so that really led me to want to try to put this put pen to paper. And someone gave me a piece of advice at one time about book writing, which was that you should only write a book if it's more painful not to write it than it is to write it, because the process of writing a book is, as you might imagine, it's very, very onerous, it's very demanding, it's very frustrating. And so I took that advice, and I did feel that way. I legitimately felt that if I didn't write this thing, that I would feel worse about that. And so I actually just took I took some time off work, I took a quarter off, and I just locked myself up in an office, a very nice office in Greece for the first little while, and just wrote the damn manuscript. So that's how it happened.
Is that the same office in the same trip where I believe you talked about it in the book, where your kids were laughing at you for choosing a certain item on the menu?
Well, it's a trip that I've done many times because I have family connections to Greece, and so I do go back often. So yeah, that anecdote was based on the return flight from one of those previous trips. Yeah.
Got it. Before I get back to the book first, or the contents of the book, I was actually going to ask you about the process of writing a book. And here's why, as it relates to sales, is that when, frankly, even in preparing for this book, or looking at great athletes, or observing the outcome of great salespeople, we always take the finished product for granted, right? We're like, oh, there's a book, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, Doug Cole write a book. It was like inevitable. Of course he wrote a book, because he's Douglas Cole. That's why he wrote a book, right? But nobody actually appreciates the time and effort that it takes to actually get something accomplished and out to the world. Whether or not that is, preparing for a sales meeting, and then ultimately closing the deal, and being a perennial President's Club member, or writing a book, it's always the work that I think goes underrated and underappreciated. So just before we get back to the content of the book for a moment, you said you took off a quarter to write the book. You went to Greece. That reminds me, by the way, of Rocky when he went to Russia to go train to fight Drago. But how many hours a day would you have sat on the computer and written the book? And then I noticed in the book that you source a lot of other sources, a lot of books, a lot of articles, a lot of other people. How, I guess, I don't know a better word, but how laborious was it to put all that together and make a coherent book?
Yeah, well, I've thought a lot about this. I've thought about the whole process and what has gone into this, and the actual writing, sitting down in front of a computer and writing was. That's something that misrepresents what actually goes into the writing process. There's a lot of stuff that happens before that time. And I think that, I guess one of the things that I've learned as I look back on this whole process is that a book has to start with some kind of social feedback loop that generates let's call it emergent content, right? In order to have any, I think, chance of being a book that is going to resonate with people. I think if you just sort of sit in your office one day and sort of dream a bunch of ideas and think, oh, I'm sure the world's going to love this, and then that becomes a book, that's a very high risk way of writing a book. I know it happens. I know that there are some people in history, some of them extremely well known, who have done just that. But generally speaking, I think it makes sense to have some kind of social feedback loop that makes you aware of ideas as they emerge from the interplay between what you're thinking and what other people are telling you about your thoughts. And that's basically what happened in my case. I had this feedback loop that had been established because I was trying to build this mini MBA as a side project at LinkedIn. I was getting feedback from the people in our global sales team who were taking that course. I was iterating it based on their feedback. I was testing it out in other contexts. And all those interactions and iterations led to an emergent content that I was able then to say, okay, well, now I have some content that has been validated through serial feedback, and then I've collected all these notes along the way. And so at that point, I was able to put a structure together of how the book was going to look, and then with the structure, then I could write. So when you ask how much time was involved with writing in Greece, I mean, it doesn't take into account, all those hundreds and hundreds of hours of iterating content and preparing the outline and so forth. There's a lot that sort of sits underneath the iceberg.
So it's much harder than I thought, right, before I asked that question.
Well, I mean, it's natural because, as you say, you don't think of that naturally when you see the book. You just think of the final product, and you imagine it's just a matter of writing that. But there's a lot of thinking that precedes the writing, I would say.
One of the things that you said about the feedback loop reminds me of entrepreneurs and people who start companies, which is that, if you start a company with just sort of licking your finger and putting it up in the air and hoping that something's gonna catch, good luck, it can happen, but you should be listening to the market and customers and whomever to say, there's a real problem out here, let me go and solve it.
Absolutely, absolutely. A book is basically a business venture. Just like a business, you have to know who your target buyer is. Just as you asked me a moment ago, who's the target audience for this book. I've spent a lot of time talking to people in the publishing space, people in PR and people on the publishing side, and many of them say, they can't believe the number of authors who show up with a book and say, when they're asked, who the audience is, they say, "Oh, well, it's anyone. It's anyone who might be interested in this." Yeah, it just doesn't give you much hope for success if you can't sort of put some parameters around your target audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Let's get into the mindset progression and the mindset progression that you see people go through that have mastered the craft of an enterprise seller. The three mindsets.
Yeah, well, this is definitely one of the first things that I noticed. I started to see a pattern when I was watching people progress as sellers. And what I saw was that when people first started out in sales, they were fundamentally uncomfortable about the fact that they were being asked to approach a very busy stranger and to try to get that person to buy something that he or she might not actually need. And because of that discomfort, the seller was fundamentally trying to be as likable and as charming as possible. And so I've divided the typical journey of a sales professional into these three phases. Phase one being likability. It's all about that for the most part. And then what I also noticed was that as people became better at selling, they graduated to the next level, which I call mutuality. And that is the level at which people tend to think more in terms of win-win outcomes and how can I make sure I satisfy your objectives and satisfy mine at the same time? And, we all benefit from this, right? And that's definitely a better place to be. But I wouldn't say it's the highest place. The third level I would characterize as objectivity. And it's a very, very rare space to occupy for a seller, because that's the moment at which the client will view you as a seller as being someone who is a legitimately trusted advisor. And that's extremely hard to do in sales, of course, because everyone knows it's perfectly transparent that the seller has a quota, the seller has a commission they're working to achieve. And therefore, strictly speaking, the seller isn't disinterested in the same way, let's say, a bona fide consultant might be. Nonetheless, the people who do this really well, they manage to achieve that level of objectivity. They manage to attain a state in which the client does trust them. And so what I wanted to do in the book is try to break it down and ask, well, if you were to somehow pierce that veil and get to the point where your self-interested motives were perceived to be irrelevant and you were actually at the table as a trusted advisor, even though you are a seller, what would be the component parts of that mindset that would allow you to be more trusted? And so the book is an attempt to just break down I would say that the three key components of that more objective mindset.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. How does one achieve objectivity, or as you said in the book, plausible objectivity? Like, in other words, if you can break it apart and say, here are the things that really will help a seller who's stuck on mutuality, let's just say, how do they break through? Is it just a matter of experience, confidence? And what is it? More wins?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a combination of how you see yourself. And I think it's a question of how you see your role. So the nature of it's a psychological challenge, in other words, that one needs to overcome. Everyone, you tend to be more self-absorbed in the earlier stages of a career because you're worried about how you're being perceived. As you become more comfortable with, everything that needs to happen in order to close a deal, and as you become a master of all the variables in play, then it becomes less about yourself and more about just taking a step back and detaching from things that are going on. So when I say that it's about how you view yourself, I think that sellers many of them tend to underplay or to sell themselves short in terms of the way they see themselves. Many of them don't feel that they can be a trusted advisor, because of this barrier that I've described of having a self-interested agenda. And so they feel there's a limit on what they can achieve, and so they just work within those limits. So I think that's the first thing, is just sort of viewing yourself as being someone who can transcend those limits and be a truly trusted advisor. And then I think, just in terms of the way you view the conversation, it's about detaching from your personal interest and focusing on what's actually going on. And that's why I've tried to define these external and organizational and interpersonal dimensions, so that you can focus on those as opposed to yourself in getting to that more objective frame of mind.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. If you can get, by focusing on, as we talk about in terms of becoming a strategist, becoming a change agent, and decision architect, and all of those components, the more that you're focusing on the prospect or your customer and the things that they care most about, the more you get out of your own head. And now, probably as a result of getting out of your own head and you're not thinking about yourself as much, it's almost like plausible objectivity becomes almost inevitable in a way. With that. Fair to say.
I think that's fair. It reminds me a little bit, as someone gave me a good piece of advice. I remember several years ago, I was trying to get ready for a public speaking talk, and I was a little nervous about this. And the person said, just ask yourself, how am I helping them? How am I helping them? So stop thinking about how they're viewing you up on stage, and just ask yourself, how am I helping them? And to your point, exactly, I think that a key part of that mindset shift is just getting out of your own head and just focusing relentlessly on their reality in those three dimensions.
Yeah, another thing too, I mentioned wins and experience. I think one of the things for people who are, let's say, less experienced, maybe they're just starting a new job, maybe they're experienced salespeople, but they're at a new job, maybe they've been at a job for a while, or maybe they're just, frankly, just starting their career. I think small wins obviously build confidence. And then once you have confidence, I think you get closer to that plausible objectivity as well, because you're not so on your own, just like you were on stage there. It's like, I think once you start that mind shift, it becomes a completely different game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's talk about those. So becoming a strategist, change agent, and decision architect. As it pertains to becoming a strategist, let's start with how you define strategy and what some of the misconceptions are about that. Because I think when I talk about people on my podcast and I introduce them to the podcast, I say we talk about vision, strategy, and execution. And I always try to give context to each one of those components: vision, strategy, and execution. And every time I go into strategy, I always think, wait, is that part of the vision? Right? Is that part of the execution? Like, where is that? So help us understand that, and then how to become an effective strategist.
Yeah, I think that strategy it's one of these words, we have so many words in business that are buzzwords, that are effectively meaningless in the way that we use them. And I would argue that strategy is very often one of those words. People will just attach the word strategic or strategy to an otherwise ordinary business initiative, and it just seems to give that initiative more weight and more gravitas. But there is, in fact, there is a specific definition, or there's a lot of literature around what strategy is supposed to be. A lot of people confuse strategy with just pure objectives like financial objectives or performance targets, or maybe more abstract statements like vision and mission. But strategy is really about making very, very explicit choices and trade-offs. It's as much about deciding what not to do as what you are going to do. And it's about very, very consciously limiting the scope of your ambition to a very particular area in which you think you have a relative advantage. That is in essence what a strategy is. And there's a lot of ink that's been spilled on this topic, but what I try to do in the book is boil this down as this, not just this concept, but other ones as well. I really try repeatedly to just simplify things. And what I try to do with strategy is boil down to two questions: where do they compete, and how do they win? So when you think about any company, if you can answer those questions, if you can answer those two questions, where do they compete and how do they win, you have essentially demonstrated that you understand their strategy. Because if you understand where they compete, what that means is that you through your analysis and through your conversation with that client, you figured out who their target buyer is, you figured out which area of the market they have chosen to play in. Let's say, for instance, they're going after enterprise sellers in the tech and financial services space, but they are quite explicitly not going after B2C sellers who are in the retail space or in the CPG space or what have you, right? That company has made a very particular choice. And so you've understood where they compete. And then you also understand with that second question, how they win. That means implicitly, you understand what is the relative advantage of this company in comparison to the other firms that are vying for that particular space in the market. What gives them an edge? And so that is the essence of strategy. And that's how I think you can come to an understanding of a client strategy just with those two questions.
Those two questions, should you have those questions to a certain extent answered before your initial reach out somehow? Obviously, there's a lot of information, depending on the size of the company, it might be public, it might not be public, but should you bring some sort of knowledge of those two answers to those two questions before you come? Or are you saying once the engagement starts, once there's a communication, a dialogue, that's when it's time to become a strategist, and you should be expected to be a strategist?
I think there's always some degree of research and preparation that goes into any call that you have with anyone in an organization. Whether you're obviously, the level of that preparation needs to be much more intense the higher up you go in the organization. But I do think that sales, when done well, before every conversation, there's at least some hypothesis of what matters to that person, and so that can vary a lot depending on whom you're speaking to. But I think you should have some working hypothesis of what you think that company is doing, and if you don't, then that's something you need to try to figure out as quickly as possible through talking to people. But yeah, I mean, my basic intention is that you're to be credible as an enterprise seller, particularly if you're relying on the endorsement of the senior ranks to get your check signed. To be credible at that level, you need to show that you understand their strategy, and so that needs to guide your effort.
What if you're wrong in that, right? In other words, what if you've made assumptions about where they compete and how they will win in your research in one way or the other? Maybe it's not even that off, but you reach out with that in mind. Does it lower your credibility or your trust level? And is that to be expected, right? In other words, are you not supposed to? We shouldn't necessarily expect that we're going to be 100% dead on that in that first call.
Well, the consequences of being wrong are going to be different, again, depending on whom you're speaking to. If you eventually are working your way up to a board meeting and you present a hypothesis which is flat out wrong, then you will obviously lose credibility. If you are wrong as you're information gathering and you're testing your hypothesis with the client at a lower level and you're being told that you're wrong, I don't think that's a big deal. And as a matter of fact, it's very helpful to be told that you're wrong and to get some sort of pushback, because that provides you with a feedback loop and it provides you with an opportunity to iterate and refine your own thoughts. So I think people in sales, they learn that resilience is extremely important. You can't be too fussed about getting something slightly wrong. It's the dialogue that allows you to go deeper and to understand the firm at a much deeper level. So I wouldn't say it's intrinsically anything to worry about to be wrong, provided it's in the earlier stages.
We're obviously talking about research. What are the other ways that someone can become an effective strategist?
Well, I think that it's important to have some frameworks that you can bring to bear in your discussions. It's something to guide your questions and your research. It's those two questions: where do they compete? How do they win? Those are big, wide-ranging questions in a sense, and so it's good to have slightly more focused frameworks that help you to get to that answer. And so one of the frameworks I talk about in the book is the customer value proposition. And this, what I'm saying is that if you're trying to figure out a firm's strategy, one of the bottom-up ways you can do that is to put yourself in the shoes of the target customer of that company. And when you think about when you think about the customer of your customer, and how that person sees the world, and you try to go through the components of a value proposition. What's the problem that you're trying to solve, or your client's trying to solve for that person? who is that customer? What's the profile or persona they're going after? How are they positioning it to their service or product to that person? What are the alternatives that individual would consider? What are the comparative advantages and disadvantages of the client? When you go through the components of a value proposition systematically from the perspective of your customer's customer, that I think is an effective way to understand where they're competing. That gives you a very clear sense of where they decided to compete and how they can win. So that'd be one example of just of using a slightly more focused framework in order to answer those two questions.
Let's get into how to become a change agent. But before I forget, I want to ask this question, which is that in that part of the book, you shared a fictional rejection letter as an example of what an enterprise tech seller might receive when they mistakenly assume that they're hitting all the salient points of the prospect. One thought that came to mind as I was reading that rejection letter is that it was thoughtful and it was longer than I would expect a rejection letter to be. Is that typical? Tell me about that.
Well, yeah, I should explain briefly so people understand. There's this thought experiment in the book where I tried to push myself to stand in the shoes of a client who had rejected a pitch from me as a salesperson. And I tried to phrase this letter in such a way as to make this customer really seem heroic. In other words, completely take my own ego out of the situation, just thoroughly embrace the worldview of this customer and assume that this person is much more in the right than I was, and to try to just fill out all the details as to why that person did what he or she did. And why it made eminent sense and was actually the heroic thing for that person to do. It was heroic to reject my sales pitch. And so I went through that thought exercise and put it in the book as an example of just really, really fully embracing the perspective of a client who says no, because I felt that was a good way to thoroughly understand the headspace of a client who decides not to move forward with your product or service. And so it's a little bit of an artful exercise, because it's gone longer than it tries to detail out all those elements that would have been responsible for the resistance. And but I think implicit in that exercise is this idea that many of us, when we are encountering resistance from a client, we assume that it's the client's problem. We assume that the client is, I don't know, they're just not getting it. They're not embracing the modern way of working. They're behind the times. They're blind to what's in their interest, right? We just have this natural instinct to villainize the client. And so what I tried to do is force myself to see what's actually noble in the client's response. And that, I think, helps you to think about change in a much more effective way, and to think about the barriers that you're up against.
But so is that typical, or it's atypical for it to be that well thought out? Because I would love to have that sort of a rejection letter, because it's really, really helpful, for sure, as you said. But I'm just curious, because I've never obviously been in that position. So I'm just curious, is that something that?
Well, I think that hypothetical letter, that fictional letter, that is a fair representation of, it's sort of a composite of things that I've picked up from different clients in many different conversations. It's not from one particular conversation. It's sort of an aggregation of experiences that I've had with a few different clients, and it sort of distills many reasons why the client would choose to say no. So yeah, it's a fictional letter, but it's definitely based on a number of client conversations.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, cool. You mentioned energy as it pertains to a change agent. Tell me how energy relates to this.
Well, when you think about a sales prospect, if you believe that you have something truly valuable to offer an organization, the easiest way to get that organization to move forward with your product or service is to find a pre-existing energy source and to work with that, as opposed to trying to convince and persuade and bang the table and get people to see the light as you see it. And it's a very simple insight, but it's surprisingly uncommon. And a lot of people will waste a lot of cycles and spin their wheels as they try to make that case in a forceful manner, as opposed to looking for the energy source. And I think that, the most successful influencers, the most successful persuaders, the most successful sellers, they're just good at figuring out who has an agenda in our organization. Why does that person feel really strongly about that agenda? Maybe because there's something that he or she is going to gain from it, but there's some reason why that there's this initiative matters to that person or to this team. And the salesperson who is a change agent is able to find that energy source and to just feed it and nurture it. And so it's not a matter of convincing someone to do anything different. It's a matter of explaining to them how to do what they're already doing in a more effective way.
It's good to hear you or read that in your book, because when I hear, a challenger or somebody that's a change agent, it was always my perception that it was someone who was exactly the former, which is to really focus on, regardless of what someone is doing, somebody might be inclined to do. It's your job to be as an effective salesperson to change that mind, right? And to get them to do something that they aren't necessarily inclined to do. What you're saying is this where you use the word catalysis as well in the book, where it's like you get something that is already started and you're just sort of letting it naturally go in that direction?
That's right. Yeah. I use there's a great analogy which comes from another book that I've referenced on change, and it talks about change being analogous to chemistry rather than physics. Physics is all about pushing the chair out of the way. Catalysis in chemistry is all about adding that additional component that sparks a catalytic reaction. And so you're working with what already exists. Yeah, my view is that this goes back to our initial conversation about how the salesperson sees themselves. That you as a salesperson are now living at a time where you actually really are a change agent. We are so deeply interconnected, and firms are so much more reliant on these different informational nodes throughout the company that a seller actually has a legitimate advisory role to play in terms of championing a change agenda, and helping people within the organization be more successful in advancing, their own change agenda. So that's the premise of that section.
What if I can't find any energy for change? Does that mean I'm not asking the right questions, or perhaps there's just no energy there for a particular initiative?
Well, it's the nature of any company that companies have to grow in order to survive. And if that company, for whatever reason, is not growing because they've made that conscious decision or because they're incapable of it, that might be the case in theory. But generally speaking, every single company needs to grow continually. Otherwise, they're just going to get shut down, either by their shareholders or their private ownership team. And so in order to grow, there needs to be an energy source. There needs to be some view of some urgent priority that is getting a lot of attention, and was getting a lot of airplay within that organization. So I think it is fair to say that in every company, there is some kind of energy source, because that's the essence of our economic system. So it is the responsibility of the salesperson to find it.
How would you coach that for someone who may have because to me it sounds like obviously it's paramount, right? In other words, nothing moves according to what we're talking about here without that energy. And if you're not able to uncover that energy, then we can talk about everything else, but it won't necessarily matter if you have that, if you don't have the ability to find that energy source. What are some of the ways that you've coached people, or that you've advised or seen work effectively to find that energy source?
I think that there's some simple questions that tend to work. And one of those questions is, what is getting a lot of attention and what's getting a lot of airplay in the company right now? That's a fairly objective way to ask it. Some people, I think, make a mistake of asking more personal questions, about that for that individual. What do you think? What do you think really matters? You can often get an answer which is very unique to that person's point of view. It can be, right? But I think the better place to start is simply to ask, what are the initiatives that are getting most attention, most airplay for your team? And people will almost always have an answer to that question. There's usually some kind of initiative that is just coming up in all the management meetings and all the company all hands meetings and whatever. And so your job is to try to figure out, what is that theme or themes.
Got it. That makes sense. And let's talk about decision architects now. And let me just stop there. What's a decision architect?
Well, a decision architect is someone who shapes the variables that impact human decision making. And the reason why I think this is another key area of competency for an enterprise seller is that it represents that third realm of interpersonal dynamics. When you're dealing with another human being, you're dealing with human psychology, and there's a lot that behavioral economics, which is a discipline that I've tried to bring into this book and to show some of the core concepts of behavioral economics, because I think that they're directly applicable to sales professionals. And so most basically, when you think about how a sale happens, what you're trying to do in a sale is you're trying to work within these bounds of human attention, human rationality, and human self-interest. And those are the basic principles of behavioral economics. And so I sort of walk through a couple of examples in each case of how you work within those bounds. How do you pierce the bounds of attention, for example, through influence levers or things like the peak end rule? And so I try to distill again and simplify a lot of these heady concepts from behavioral economics and just make them really practical for the sales professional who is trying to be a decision architect, who is trying to shape and work with those variables in such a way as to drive action on the client side.
You talk about the Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, the Art of Persuasion, I think is the full title, something like that, and the 7 levers of influence. Tell us a little bit about those and how they affect decision making and why.
Yeah, so Cialdini wrote this book, I don't know, I guess it was 30 years ago now, and it's been a massive bestseller. And it's sort of required reading for anyone in sales. Anyone who has a job where you're required to influence someone really needs to read the book. And he talks about these 7 influence levers, things like social proof, authority, consistency, likability, reciprocity. And what he's saying essentially is that it has a lot in common with behavioral economics, really. But he's saying that a lot of us don't have time to do a thorough assessment of things as they come across our desk or come into our consciousness. And because we don't have time, we rely on these shortcuts, these heuristics that help us quickly make sense of information. And so these influence levers are incredibly pervasive. I mean, all of us are aware of them. We encounter them literally every day because the business world has sort of embedded them into our reality. So if I go onto the Amazon site, for instance, and I'm looking to buy something, I will immediately look to see what the reviews of something are, because social proof is a cue. It's a shortcut that allows me to make a quick judgment about whether something is important. I know that if there was a study in terms of reciprocity. There was a study done on what happens when a waiter brings extra breath mints along with the check when you bring the check to the people at a restaurant, and tips go up by roughly 20% with extra mints, because people feel indebted to the server with the fact that they just receive what feels like a gift. So these are just so pervasive. They're like the furniture of our lives because they have been proven to work time and time again. One of my favorite examples of scarcity, which is another one of the Cialdinian principles, came to me a few weeks back. I was reading that this site was a hotel booking site in Europe, has implemented this new technology where they'll show you in real time as the number of rooms or places, for that particular, whatever it is, a car or a hotel room, are just being bought out. And so you can see them going down. And that apparently just caused their revenues to skyrocket to the point where they were having system issues. So these are just well-established elements of human psychology that Cialdini talked about in his book. And I think anyone in sales needs to understand them and almost have them. I mean, I actually have a checklist on my desk where I make sure that anytime I'm about to send an important email or communication, I just quickly look to see whether I've used any of these influence levers to ensure that my message is as strong as possible.
I actually went back and looked at the initial outreach that I got from your team right before we started to see how many how many levers were in there, and a lot. I didn't finish it because it was literally like 1 minute before, but I found like 3 or 4 almost immediately. I'm guessing that all 7 were in there for sure. I realized as we're going through this, one of the things that I wanted to cover that I didn't, apparently my notes are out of order, is, which to me is really important, are the personal interest, social influence, and structural surroundings. I believe that's pertaining to change agent. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I missed that part.
Yeah, no, absolutely fine. In the change agent section, what I'm trying to do is give people a framework. Again, this book is all about distilling some of these core concepts and giving people frameworks that have been tried and tested. And for the change agent, yeah, there's a very well-known framework that I've adapted for the selling context. And it sort of talks about how any change that happens in either our personal lives or our professional lives always combines these 3 things of personal interests, social influences, and structural surroundings. And so the challenge of a change agent within a sales context is to try to advance your agenda with reference to those 3 things. And I've talked about in the book, I've talked about this example. I use the example of a seller who managed to take a program that was very small within a large company and make it massive. And the way she was able to do that was she was able to tap into personal interests. In other words, she tied the importance of her service to one of the key initiatives in that company that was getting a lot of airplay at the time. That was the energy source that we were talking about. She had a very clear social component where she spent some time figuring out who are the influencers in this organization, who are the people who are known as those who are trying out new things and are highly respected for the kinds of innovation that they're championing. And so she made sure that she got those people identified and she got time with them. And then in terms of structural surroundings, she spent a lot of time thinking, where is it that the people that I'm targeting actually spend their time in a digital sense? Where are they going for training? What are the regular meetings they're having? What are they using for CRM? How can we create a surrogate presence within each of these areas so that there's a structural component to it? And so she had this very systematic way of thinking about her role as a change agent, and that I think was the main reason why she was successful. And so I introduced the framework, and then I show in practice how it actually happens.
Is there a process that one can go through to get a better understanding of who has the social influence within an organization? In other words, it's one thing to say identify the people with social influence. It's another thing to sort of operationalize it and tactically go about it, either by ruling people out or ruling people in. What should we look at?
Well, sales is a business where you ask questions. It's all about getting good at asking questions and gathering information through questions. And I think for this particular challenge of identifying those influencers, I think it's a matter of just quite simply asking a number of people within the organization and ask them, listen, if you had to nominate anyone or any group of people within this company who is sort of known as an innovative person and who is highly respected for that, which is actually an important distinction. There are some people who are known to be highly innovative, but they're not necessarily respected. They're just sort of viewed as mad scientists and eccentric types, right? So you want to know that someone is not only innovative, but also well respected as an innovator. And if you just ask that question a bunch of times and you start to gather names, at some point you're going to notice that there's overlap, that the same names are coming up repeatedly from talking to different people. And once you've picked up on that, once you've seen that overlap, then you can approach those individuals and legitimately say, this is when you're using influence levers from Cialdini. I've spoken to a number of your peers. Many of them have referred to you as someone who is an innovative champion in the company. And so, that sort of plays the likability button. It plays to the social proof button. And so that's how you start to build that coalition that you need in order to drive an ambitious change agenda.
I love it. when I initially read structural surroundings, the first thing that came to mind, which I guess was a wrong assumption, is that I was assuming, okay, well, if I'm talking to Douglas over the phone, let's just say, or over Zoom, maybe I need to go meet him for lunch, as opposed to what you're talking about, which is get invited to a meeting or somewhere where decisions are made. Was I wrong to assume that, or could that be part of it? And maybe that's for somebody that's maybe selling services and consulting, as opposed to, the technology.
Yeah, the structural surroundings point, it's basically, it comes from this, there's actually a metaphor which is at the heart of these three things, the personal, social, and structural. It's the metaphor of the image of the rider and the elephant. If you think about how, or you think about where the rider takes that elephant, there are three things that are happening simultaneously and that determine where that rider and elephant go. And so it's, first of all, a function of the explicit directions that the rider is giving the elephant. That's analogous to the personal dimension. Then there are these strong social, kind of emotional elements, which are represented by the elephant itself. And then the structural thing is just the landscape, the path, the way that's shaped, that determines where the rider and elephant go. So a little bit more concretely, in a business context, we start to absorb what's important based on what's around us, and if I'm constantly talking about, if I'm constantly in a digital environment, let's say my CRM system, because that's where I go on a regular basis, and I notice that there's a particular widget that's always there, then I just assume that that's something that should be there because it's important. It's earned its place. And we tend to, we think things are important because we think about them. We don't think about them because they're important necessarily. It's that when they're just part of our environment, part of our regular conversation and physical environment, they become important. And so the role of the change agent is to try to create that presence within the kind of physical and digital and conversational environment of that person that you're trying to influence, so that your solution takes on greater importance.
Kind of goes back to that catalysis that you mentioned before. In other words, if it's already happening, all you're doing is just tapping it towards the right direction, because they're already doing it anyways, right? They're already in that environment, and you're just inserting yourself there. I think, by the way, the whole lunch thing that I just mentioned, I think that's actually part of Robert Cialdini's influence book, where they say something to the effect of, it'll be, if you want get somebody in a good mood, fill their belly, and then ask them for, the tough ask, as opposed to before lunch. I think that was where I was getting.
I see. Yeah.
What about motivation and ability? Where do those two things come in to play when you talk about the three things that we just talked about: social influence, structural surroundings, and personal interest?
Yeah, well, that's sort of level two. In the book, I talked about those three components of personal, social, and structural. And then I think you can further break it down and think about what motivates people in each of those realms, and then what's their ability, where do they need help in order to just get it done. So in other words, people do things differently, first because they want to, and that's motivation. And second of all, because it's easy for them to do so. If there's any friction involved, then that diminishes the chance that they're going to do something. So if I go back to the example of this seller who went from a very small program to a very large program, she thought about this very systematically, as I said. And so, for example, in the case of the social dimension, the motivation element there, socially speaking, was because she had recruited these well-known and well-respected innovators within the company, she tapped into people's desire to emulate those individuals. So that was the motivation side of it. And then in terms of their ability to motivate them, she gave them templates. She gave them ready to go templates that were allowing them to use her solution in a much more intuitive and user-friendly fashion. So she lowered the friction, and then that's what I mean by ability. And then she increased their motivation by giving them people to emulate, because of this coalition she had built with these innovative people. So there's a way you can break down each one of these: personal, social, and structural, by thinking about motivation and ability. And that's what I try to show in the book as well.
I had a feeling I was going to want more time because we're very quickly running out and I have so many more questions to ask. Let me just I'll just ask something that I just need to ask. And then we'll get into the rapid fire 5, but just realize that there's so many more questions, and maybe we'll do maybe we'll do a part 2 if you're open to it. I don't know if you're open to it or not, but that would be awesome if you are. Okay, well, you don't have to answer that now, but
I'm definitely open.
Okay, good. Awesome. So here's the question I have for you, which is, out of the 3, strategist, change agent, or decision-making architect, where do you see people struggling the most? If so, why?
I think people struggle the most with the strategy side of things, because I don't think it's natural for people in sales to think of themselves as strategists. I'm trying to change that with this book. I think that many people in sales don't have a business education or an MBA education, and so they feel as though they haven't earned the right to view themselves as being a strategic partner in that sense. But what I'm trying to explain is that it's not as complicated as you think. I'm trying to break down strategy into a manageable set of questions that allow anyone, even those who don't have any fancy business school education or whatever, to understand in essence what that means for any company. And so I think that there's a reason why I focus on mindset so much in the book, is that I think that mindset is one of these constraints that a lot of people feel, and how they view themselves is so critical. There's a very famous quote that I came across many years ago from the famous Stephen Covey, 7 Habits guy. Mm-hmm. And he said that if you're looking to make incremental change, change someone's behavior, and if you're looking to make quantum change, you change someone's paradigm. You change the way they see themselves. And so that's why I'm putting a lot of emphasis on this mindset component in the book, and encouraging people to elevate their own self-regard.
Yes. Maybe I'm going to try to squeeze one more question in before the rapid fire 5, which is, as a sales leader, obviously you have a team and you're interviewing people. And of course, I care about this because I'm a recruiter who helps people find jobs. How, of these 3 things, right? Strategist, change agent, decision architect, how do you interview for that? In other words, are you screening for that in an interview? And then is there a way to either rule someone out very quickly or rule someone in very quickly based on the conversation you're having with them?
Well, this is a whole fascinating topic. I love the whole question of interviewing and assessing talent. I mean, look, I think that when you're interviewing for any role, you need to define what is the purpose of that role, what are the outcomes you're driving toward in that role, and what are the underlying competencies that you think will maximize the chance that someone is able to deliver those outcomes, right? And so I think with any role, you need to define the competencies. So in my case, when I'm interviewing for someone in sales, I have a list of 10 competencies, and one of those competencies is business acumen. One of those competencies is, for example, communication. So how are you able to simplify the complex, whatever? But on the matter of acumen, I do test for that and ask someone to explain how they know, whether they understand what drives company performance and how to speak to an operational agenda at a company. And so I think that's the sort of thinking process you need to go through in order to define what you need in a role and then to test for it.
Okay, well that'll be a large part of the second interview that we do, since you lean in on that, which is evaluating talent. So that's good. That'll be fun. Yeah. Okay, let's get into the rapid fire 5. Yes, if you've been listening to this podcast and going back to that, naming it that because it just makes more sense, and it is designed to be rapid fire. So you ready, Douglas?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. What motivates you?
Learning across multiple domains.
Name a big goal you have right now, and when would you like to accomplish it?
I want to sell 5,000 copies of the book, at least 50% of which to corporate buyers, to actual institutional buyers.
By when?
Within the next 2 years.
What's your most preferred way to learn new information and to stay sharp?
Podcasts and reading would be podcast reading and peer conversations.
How many hours of sleep do you average per night?
Just under 7.
What's your favorite thing to do when you aren't working?
Swim in the Mediterranean in Greece. You know.
Right. That I don't think I'll ever get that answer again. So
Yeah.
Douglas Cole, the new author of the Sales MBA, How to Influence Corporate Buyers. Thank you for going over quota.
Thank you. Really
Bye,
appreciate it.
everyone. Cue in the music.